Thank you, Mr. President, for the recognition. In 5 months, Americans will go to the polls and vote. That's our heritage. It's something to celebrate and something to protect. But this year, many Americans are fed up with our political system. They're tired of corporations and the super wealthy controlling our politicians and our elections. They don't trust our democracy to reflect the will of we the people. What has changed since our founding fathers began the Constitution with those words? What has changed since several decades ago, when many more Americans had more confidence in our government? I'll tell you what I think has changed. People are now questioning the integrity of our elections. Our campaign finance system is under siege, drowning in record amounts of money, much of it from outside groups, and much of it hidden money, dark money. Our election should not be for sale to the highest bidder. Over 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln saw the danger of too much money in politics. Lincoln warned about, and I quote from him, corruption in high places until the republic is destroyed. We are reaching that point. Money has poisoned our political system. It's no wonder the American people have lost faith in us. This is constant money chasing from special interests and very little else getting done. Our constituents want Congress to get to work and to work together, finding real solutions to real problems. That's why a few months ago, several of my colleagues and I got together to discuss the state of our democracy, our electoral system, our political system. The question we asked ourselves was, what can we do to repair this damage, to return the government to the people? The product of those meetings is the bill we introduced last week, the We the People Act. It will bring dark money out of the shadows, create a real watchdog to enforce campaign finance laws, rein in the influence of special interests and lobbyists. The We the People Act includes my constitutional amendment to allow Congress and the states to enact even more significant reforms. Reforms 5 conservative justices on the Supreme Court can't overturn. We are offering this to start a conversation about what needs to be done, to fix a broken system. I hope it will even lead to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join us in this effort. I want to talk specifically about 2 sections of the bill, and I think my colleague, Senator Merkley, who will be here momentarily, will talk about some of the other portions of the bill that are especially important to him. The first is the Democracy for All constitutional amendment, which I introduced after the Supreme Court's disastrous Citizens United ruling, when the court put a for sale sign on our elections. Changing the Constitution is a big step, I know that. As James Madison said, it should be amended only on great and extraordinary occasions. And I agree with him. But I also believe we have reached one of those rare occasions. Citizens United was wrong, it's dangerous, and it cannot stand. Amending the Constitution can take a long time, but this movement actually was started decades ago by a Republican. Many of our predecessors from both parties understood the danger. They knew that money was a corrosive impact on our elections. They spent years championing the cause. Senator Ted Stevens, a Republican icon from Alaska, introduced a constitutional amendment to overturn Buckley versus Vallejo. In 1983, he did that. Senator Stevens saw the effect that unlimited campaign expenditures were having on Congress over 3 decades. He recognized over 30 years ago that we were in an arms race, that the drive for money would only get worse, and Congress's ability to function would suffer. That was only the beginning. In every Congress, from the 99th to the 108th, Senator Fritz Hollings introduced a bipartisan constitutional amendment very similar to the one that I'm carrying this year. Senator Schumer and Senator Cochran continued the effort in the 109th Congress. Even Majority Leader McConnell once had his own constitutional amendment to limit the influence of money on our elections. That was all before Citizens United and McCutcheon, both of those decisions by the Supreme Court. It was before things went from bad to worse. The out-of-control spending since those decisions has further poisoned our elections. In a few minutes, Senator Merkley and I and our colleagues will hold a press conference about this bill. We will highlight the growth of one special interest group that has increased its spending exponentially since Citizens United. That group is the NRA. Fueled with contributions from gun manufacturers, it has Republicans so scared they don't even hold a vote on common sense steps to protect families from gun violence. Even when Americans are crying out for action, even after tragedies like Sandy Hook and Orlando, even when Democrats are holding a protest in the House chamber itself, I went to stand with them for a while yesterday. Republicans could loosen the hold the NRA has over ourselves and the Congress, has over themselves and the Congress, if they would join us in this effort to reform our elections as they have in the past. I know the political climate of an election year makes it even more difficult, but I will reintroduce this amendment in the next Congress and the next, and I hope my Republican colleagues will join me. Poll after poll shows that our constituents across the political spectrum want this amendment. New York just became the 17th state calling for Congress to pass this constitutional amendment. It's time we listen to the states. I'd also like to talk about my bill to replace the dysfunctional Federal Election Commission. With a new Federal Election Commission, we would replace it with what we call a new Federal Election Administration. It's also included in the We the People Act. My constitutional amendment will allow Congress to finally enact meaningful reforms. But meanwhile, it's more important than ever to have a cop on the beat, enforcing the rules on the books. That job is supposed to go to the Federal Election Commission. But in today's hyper-partisan environment, the FEC is powerless to enforce the law. Gridlock is pervasive. One of its own commissioners admitted that there's a slim chance they'd be able to do anything this year. She called it, and I quote from her, worse than dysfunctional. The New York Times editorial board called it, and I quote, borderline useless. That's what they said about the FEC. Reform groups have dubbed it a different kind of FEC. They call it failure to enforce commission. It's time to replace the broken FEC with a new agency, one that's empowered to keep a close eye on the candidates, super PACs, and the parties, and that will finally crack down on election law violations. My friend Senator John McCain was one of the first to propose abolishing the FEC as we know it, and to create a new bipartisan agency with the teeth it needs to do the job. He and Senator Feingold introduced this bill several times in several Congresses. The Federal Election Commission Act will eliminate the FEC and start afresh. There will be a new sheriff in town standing up for voters nationwide. My constitutional amendment and the Federal Election Administration Act are just two pieces of the We the People reform package. I'll let my colleagues discuss the bills they've contributed to the effort. Senator Whitehouse, Senator Leahy, Senator King, Baldwin, and Bennett all have important pieces of this legislative package. And let me be clear, this is just a starting point. The We the People Act includes many important reforms, but there are additional things we must do to return democracy to the people. We must ensure every American has access to the polls. We need to end the gerrymandering of congressional districts, a practice that allows incumbents to stay in office indefinitely. And we must enact comprehensive public financing that will empower small donors and make their voices heard again. This is an opportunity for Congress to respond to the American people. They want, they demand reform. Congress has a long history of regulating campaign finance, often in the wake of scandal. Since 1867, we've had the Pendleton Act, the Tillman Act, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1925, the Hatch Act, the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, and the Bipartisan Campaign Act of 2002. First scandal, then reform. That is the unfortunate pattern, a pattern we can break with the We the People Act. Let's reform the system before there is another major scandal. Let's respond to the voters, Republicans and Democrats, who want a better government, a government of we the people. And Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that a summary of the We the People Act be included in the record at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.